Welcome everyone. This is the inaugural Audre Lorde Human Rights Lecture. Yes, indeed. I probably don't need to tell any of you who Audre Lorde is. She was an activist and a poet, a writer, a gadfly, a critic, a brilliant activist, someone who does not get enough honor in this world, and someone who is a leading intellectual, moral, and political light for so many of us. And so one of the things that I want to do with a little bit of power that I have, I'm Tim McCarthy, by the way, as the director of the Sexuality, Gender, and Human Rights program here at the Kennedy School, was to honor Audre Lorde, who described herself as a black lesbian mother warrior poet. And so it is with great pleasure that we inaugurate this series, which will be an ongoing series here at the Kennedy School at the Carr Center. We'll have 4 of these lectures this year, and then we hope to do at least that many next year. Ann Pellegrini, who's a distinguished scholar at NYU, will give the second one of these lectures on December 5th. But today we have the great honor of having Darnell Moore here, who is an award-winning writer and activist, someone who very much walks in the shoes of Audre Lorde's great legacy. Darnell is someone that I met actually fairly recently. We haven't even known each other a year, but I feel like we've known each other a lifetime. This was a person who I met as part of the first ever U.S. LGBT delegation to Palestine in Israel last year. Darnell and I met in a hotel in Jerusalem and immediately became friends. We were sort of kindred souls. It was like this very powerful kind of connection that we made there in a very difficult place. And have since forged a very, very deep friendship, which I know will last a lifetime. Darnell is someone whose work I deeply, deeply admire. He's a member of the editorial collective of Feminist Wire. He and Wade Davis, former NFL player, co-author a bi-monthly column in the Huffington Post called Tongues Untied, honoring Marlon Riggs' great legacy. He is at work on 2 books, one on black queer Christian thought and another edited collection called America's Autumn, which examines the intersections and convergences within contemporary American radicalism. This is someone whose activism and community organizing has won him great regard and awards. He works for Cory Booker in Newark, New York. He's from Camden, New Jersey. He currently resides in Brooklyn. He was the co-founder of the Newark Queer Oral History Project. This is someone who inspires young people all over the world, not just in his native Camden and in Newark, but in New York City. He was just in Mississippi recently with Wade Davis, speaking to 800 or 900 young people. This is someone who is a light in every life that he touches, and so it is my great, great pleasure to introduce to you the James Baldwin of my generation, my brother and friend, Darnell Moore.
Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Wow, thank you. It was really touching. James Baldwin of the generation. I wish I was as bold as he was, and my writing is critical. I didn't intend to bring the storm with me. I just survived Hurricane Sandy last weekend, and apparently I couldn't get away from the storm. But isn't that a wonderful metaphor to think about the times we're in? So I want to thank the Sexuality, Gender, and Human Rights program at the Carr Center for Human Rights here at the Kennedy School. Thank you, Tim, for the invitation to be here. It means a lot that we have been asked to gather in the honor of Audre Lorde. I was honored to participate in the 20th anniversary of Audre Lorde at CUNY at Hunter College just 3 weeks ago, and heard from her daughter and had the opportunity to talk to people who know Audre personally. A lot of us know Audre through her work, and we were moved to tears. And I'm just happy to be able to be here and walking in the legacy of those ancestors, one of which is Audre Lorde. So let's jump in and have conversation. What freedom feels like. On love, empathy, and pleasure in the age of neoliberalism. And I should stop here too to acknowledge friends in the room. Since we're talking about love and empathy and pleasure, I have a friend of mine who's been with me traveling since I was a really horrible undergraduate student at Seton Hall. And he said to me today, he was talking about, asking me something about my partner, and I said, my partner has a managerial spirit, really good with like handling finances. And Quentin said to me, you're still not good at handling finances. He knows me too well. And another young brother friend of mine, Philip, who is actually from Newark, who is now studying at Boston College and is doing a wonderful job there. He's been traveling the world doing amazing social justice work. And Quincy, who is in the back, is the co-founder of the Hispanic Black Gay Lesbian Coalition here in Boston with his partner, who are doing amazing work on the streets, ensuring that our young people have safe spaces to exist. So thank you all for being in my life, and Tim, who I love dearly, and Bethany. Thank you all for being here. I want to open with an epigraph from Grace Lee Boggs. These are the times to grow our souls. Each of us is called upon to embrace the conviction that despite the powers and principalities bent on commodifying all our human relationships, we have the power within us to create the world new. These are moving times. Countless marginalized bodies across the world have been moved to protest. Varied groups organized along peripheries, disconnected by way of spatial, social, and economic distance, now stand in solidarity against various systems of oppression. And many repressive institutions and structures are moved to resist the rebellion seeking their obliteration. Even as I read this meditation, a few seasons behind America's autumn, which is but a few paces behind the Arab Spring, brothers and sisters continue to organize around the world against the greed and corruption of what some call the corporate class, in solidarity with resistance movements like Occupy Wall Street. Women, men, cisgendered, transgendered, queer, non-queer, black, brown, white, the young, the old, have boldly and loudly called out misogyny, sexism, sexual assault under the guise of the slut walk movement, and the same continue to critique the increasing fascination with and fetishization of rape within a culture that too often condones the destruction of women's bodies. And many have been galvanized to call upon the American government to end the death penalty in response to the atrocious state execution of Troy Davis a year ago. And some are still working to push government to rethink its commitment to an industrialized prison system, which, according to a 2007 report published by the Pew Charitable Trust, now holds 2.4 million people, representing an increase of 700% since 1971. So yes, many of us are moved, and many are the movements that for now are inciting us to resist racism, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, rape culture, state-sponsored executions, heterosexism, ableism, neocolonialism, the disproportionate criminalization of men, women, and adolescents of color, and the like. But these are also the times to grow our souls, and not just our bodies. And by bodies, I mean the bodies of protest groups and bodies of counter-hegemonic knowledges, as Grace Lee Boggs reminds us. Indeed, these are times to contemplate new ways of being in an age of global consumption and consumerism that seeks to anesthetize affect, or rather diminish our ability to experience and embody love, empathy, and pleasure. That interior power, which Audre Lorde named the depth or reservoir of feeling, or the erotic. So when we answer the call to meet comrades, whether stranger or friend on bridges, in parks, on street corners, on Wall Street, at Union Square, on college grounds, in the burbs or in the hood, in pursuit of social, political, and economic justice, we engage radical resistance work that could result in ideological and material change. However, if people are only called upon to assemble in the public square with the production of certain ends in mind, like the actualization of agenda items, the ratification of certain laws, or the staying of an execution, then our radical work might itself be compromised by the very neoliberal impulses, the diminishing of the public sphere that moves towards privatization, the praising of competition and market-driven approaches, the waning of mutual concern embodied by a social safety net. These things that many of us call into question. When we are called to rally as if laborers in the social justice marketplace for the purposes of merely producing goods, like the passage of, say, same-sex marriage equality legislation, or the ceasing of drone attacks, which of course are both good ends, we become workers in the domain of justice, and not human beings with hearts, minds, and souls worthy of embrace, worthy of conversation, worthy of respect. Is it possible then that what we might be experiencing in our various yet interconnected social justice movements, and I dare say our world, is a reinstitution of the harmful forms of commodification that frustrates human relationships by diminishing the significance, the value of the very persons engaged in them? To put it another way, it is possible that even after marching next to one another, shedding a tear while in close proximity of the comrades, chanting chants, pulling the lever at the voting booth, and petitioning authorities until laws, practices, and ideas change, that we might still walk away and make our way to our destinations without knowledge of the names of those with whom we've marched, without an awareness of the life stories and context of the sister or brother whose tears we watched fall, or without a clear understanding or care for that person chanting with us in concert, who may live a life wholly different than our own. That is the work of what I name the neoliberalist enterprise of social justice organizing, and of what I testify as that which moves us away from the goals of feeling, of nourishing souls, of remaking our world of freedom. In this, the age of late capital and neoliberalism, numbness is desired and the erotic is feared. Audre Lorde aptly deemed this the fear of feeling. In her now classic essay, Uses of the Erotic as Power. How many of you read that? Uses of the Erotic. It's become a Bible for some. Lorde presages a future in the essay in which even that which we deem good is commodified. Indeed, she pretends a future where the doing of the good is trivialized and emptied of deep feeling, sensation, connection to our innermost senses of power, its union with the feelings of others, and the senses of higher purpose that often catalyze our doing of the good. She cautions, quotes, "The principal horror of any system which defines the good in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need, or which defines human need to the exclusion of the psychic and emotional components of that need. The principal horror of such a system is that it robs our work of its erotic value," end quote. The system itself, then, is guilty of embezzlement, of theft of affect, spirit, of theft of the erotic, of freedom. And why would there be a need to extinguish affect, spirit, and the erotic, except the need to disrupt those movements that move us toward each other, even if some of us within such movements might also flee feeling and resist community? In this regard, I turn to an interview with Michel Foucault titled "Friendship as a Way of Life," which testifies to the horror of alliances and companionship between would-be friends, and also of love's possibilities in an age that demonstrates antagonism toward harmony, whether evidenced between state and human bodies, by sensationalizing conflict and even profit off of war. When speaking of what he names the neat image of homosexuality, or rather, quote, "a kind of immediate pleasure of two young men meeting in the street, seducing each other with a look, grab each other's asses, and getting off in a quarter of an hour," end quote. Foucault would say that. He argues that homosexuality as a type of friendship and bond provokes unease because it, quote, cancels everything that can be troubling in affection, tenderness, friendship, fidelity, camaraderie, and companionship. Things that our rather sanitized society can't allow a place for without fearing the formation of new alliances and the tying together of unforeseen lines of force, end quote. Thus, according to Foucault, the problem is not the sexual acts committed between two men, but that individuals are beginning to love one another. It's not the sexual acts, it's this idea that the coming together of two individuals causes love. Interestingly, Lord uses, in her uses of the erotics, which was delivered as a speech at the 4th Berkshire Conference on the History of Women at Mount Holyoke College in 1978, and Foucault, whose Friendship as a Way of Life was published in 1981, both warned of an impending movement when the erotic and friendship would be evinced as antithetical forces in a system that desires competition and not collaboration. Similarly, Black lesbian poet Cheryl Clark noted in her now well-cited essay, Lesbianism as an Act of Resistance, which was also written in 1981. These times are important. 1978, 1981, 1981. That lesbianism is shunned because of the potential of mutuality present within women and women relationships. How appropriate is it that Lord, Foucault, and Clark, all three of them queer, imagined the radical potential inherent within non-heterosexual relationships under a system of capitalism that relies on a heteropatriarchal family structure for the purposes of increased production. How appropriate is it that the two were writing from within the borders of North America and other from within the borders of Europe, and all spoke these piercing prophetic words at the rise of the Reagan and Thatcher era, at the rise of what some now date as the forward of neoliberal political economic thoughts and policies. Robert McChesney defines neoliberalism as the, quote, defining political economic paradigm of our time. It refers to the policies and processes whereby a relative handful of private interests are permitted to control as much as possible of social life in order to maximize their personal profits, end quote. Though the definitions of neoliberalism are as varied as the ways in which they manifest, I want to illuminate a type of neoliberalist thought, ideology, that organizes not only political and economic life, but social life. In this regard, McChesney notes the following, and I quote at length. Democracy requires that people feel a connection to their fellow citizens, and that this connection manifests itself through a variety of non-market organizations and institutions. A vibrant political culture needs community groups, libraries, public schools, neighborhood organizations, cooperatives, public meeting spaces, voluntary associations, and trade unions to provide ways for citizens to meet, communicate, and interact with their fellow citizens. Neoliberal democracy, with its notion of the market, takes dead aim at this sector. Instead of citizens, it produces consumers. Instead of communities, it produces shopping malls. The net result is an atomized society of disengaged individuals who feel demoralized and socially powerless, end quote. Neoliberalism, then, is a theory of disengagement, and we citizens in this neoliberal age might easily be rendered as disaffected performers. This might very well be the case among those of us who fancy ourselves social justice workers, those of us who seek to do the work of human rights, those of us who desire to transform our communities, those of us who might easily forget the deep reservoir of feeling located within ourselves, that which connects us to one another, that which moves us toward the good, that which moves us toward the doing of the good. For example, it is estimated that nearly 3,000 to 4,000 bodies were in attendance at Slut Walk, New York City. And at the onset of the Occupy Wall Street resistance, it was reported that 5,000 bodies were on hand to commence the occupation. I remember the large number of people who gathered all around the world in the name of justice after Trayvon Martin was shot dead. I recall the hordes of people who stopped traffic at an Amnesty International-sponsored Visual for Justice I attended with a few friends at Union Square around the same time. But how many stopped to discuss the particularities of another's life are the similarities and dissimilarities that make us diverse persons, even while we might all be women standing against rape and violence, or the 99% or 47% standing against the class warfare waged upon us by the corporate class? How many of us stopped to ask a name? How many of us stopped to offer a handshake or a hug? How many of us today stopped to talk to someone we did not know? When we engage the other, we are necessarily forced to do the type of self-engagement that dislodges the prejudices, ignorances, and violations that many of us bear witness to as they manifest even among those seeking to do the work of justice. When we self and other engage, we begin community and soul building. That work requires us to see the other, not just as a pawn in the field in the struggle for justice, but as a human being, as a brother and a sister. When we engage the other, we resist neoliberalism's resistance to our human and spiritual connection. For it is there, deep in the interstices of intimate and affective connection, where our power lies, and when we remember to tap into that erotic power, the place where love, empathy, and pleasure reside, we animate our human and spiritual beingness and resist the commodification of our bodies, resisting the urge and the tug to exist as bodies laboring without purpose and without freedom. I propose, therefore, that we ponder the following questions, namely, what are the uses of love and empathy and pleasure in these times? In moments when intimate connection between friend and stranger is seemingly obstructed by a type of capitalist individualism that refuses community. What are the uses of love, empathy, and pleasure in the lives and work of those who seek to advance human rights and social justice in an age where even rights and justice are co-opted and commodified terms in the neoliberalist enterprise of social justice and human rights organizing? In what follows, my attempt to define love, empathy, and pleasure will incompletely capture, surely, each as particular types of affect and expressions, because each tend to begin and beget language. We feel, we know deeply, we respond to feeling, and if we can, we speak. So what follows, I only hint at possibilities, possible ways to express, through word and deed, love, empathy, and pleasure, and the possibility of their positive consequences in times that seemingly conjure hostility, disconnection, and apathy. On love. Who knew that talking about love and empathy and pleasure could dry one's mouth out? Maybe I should have talked about rage. Love is a movement. Actually, love is the movement. It is that which moves us toward one another. That to say, it is the eradication of the distance that exists between us and the other. Indeed, the radical potential in love is its ability to destroy the walls, fortifications, edges, spaces which work to separate us. If we, as Audre Lorde brilliantly notes in Uses of the Erotic, have been raised to fear the yes within ourselves, our deepest cravings, then love is a resounding yes to the yes that beckons us toward connection, communion, and companionship. It is the no to our fear of vulnerability and connection, the fear that provokes our need to disrupt feeling, even if the condition for our mutual survival are connected to such affective action. And lest I began to wax too poetic, though poetry might be the one instrument of truth that might save us in these times, I want to offer one example of love and its possibilities. 9 years ago, 15-year-old Sakia Latona Dunn, a black, masculine, performing lesbian daughter of Newark, was stabbed in her chest by an older adult male perpetrator on the corner of Broad and Market. She eventually died en route to the hospital in the presence of her best friend, who was also 15. Her blood spilled at that intersection. A literal and metaphorical intersection where multiple bodies and identities traverse. She died on May 11, 2003, 15 days before her 16th birthday. 9 years later, however, the same city that witnessed her death has been catalyzed by her spirit. And while Sakia is no martyr, and no murdered child is, her death has catalyzed a movement. To be sure, it would take some time to share all the good that has transpired in the city since Sakia's tragic ending and the city's new becoming, but I offer this particular example to illuminate the radical power of love as what Shayla Sandoval names a hermeneutics of social change. In other words, love is also the lens through which we might read new and more just futures. I share this particular example to illuminate the ways that love might function as the lenses through which we discern the path that we must take as we move toward the end of justice and transformation. After Sakia died in Newark, a black, brown, working class, and poor space often conjured in the national imaginary as largely homophobic. Hundreds upon hundreds of young, old folk took to the streets in protest and mourning, in celebration and remembrance. The same intersection that had been painted with Sakia's blood, an intersection that illuminates and compounds the differences of those situated on the underside of heteropatriarchy and heterosexism, of transphobia and ableism, of classism and racism. That same intersection had become a crossing, a meeting place of the dissimilar. Love compelled Newark public school students, variously defined across a spectrum of sexual identities, to march in tow, in one another's arms, with tear-drenched faces, in memory of their lost Newark sister. Love compelled all manner of adults, parents, politicians, faith leaders, community organizers, queer folk, trans folk, straight, homophile, and former homophobe, to erase the distance that often separated them. Love, that which eliminates the space that fractures our connection, compelled the type of deep, intimate connecting that has resulted in so many significant outcomes in Newark, including the adoption of the state of New Jersey's first municipal mayoral advisory commission on LGBT concerns, the state's first publicly and privately supported after-school program for LGBTQ youth, the state's first archive project collecting and chronicling the lives of queers, the state's first citywide community forums for elected officials specifically focused on the needs of LGBTQ citizens, and so much more. But had a people not come together, had they resisted the yes deep within themselves to connect with the other, the momentum necessary to enact justice would not have been formed. Had I personally not responded to the yes deep within myself, to work in solidarity with sisters and brothers, I too would have missed a movement. How many movements have we missed? How many movements have we missed? Because we failed to love. More importantly, community was forged out of a tragedy at a crossing that many would have traversed without ever connecting. The communal connection sparked communal transformation. Communal connection sparked communal transformation. Connection. First, transformation followed. Cultural anthropologist Jafari Sinclair Allen, when speaking of love's work in the lives of the black and queer, had this to say, quote, "For black queers, survival has always been about finding ways to connect some of what is disconnected, to embody, and to remember. This, he says, is the social erotics of love at work, end quote. Alan is correct. The social erotic capacity of love is its ability to link our human and spiritual beingness. Love makes possible our survival because it is a force of connection. And we need love in these times indeed, as scholar Winshew Lee notes, quote, "We need to love our love." Reminds me of the Stevie Wonder song, "Love and Need a Love." I will sing it, but my voice is bad. I can really sing, That's quick. I'll show up. Winshew Lee says, "We need to love our love to sustain earthly and spiritual bonds and solidarity. A unity of feeling and action to resurrect humanity from the tomb of neoliberalism," end quote. On empathy. Empathy is a feeling and an enactment of intentional regard for others. It is a positively antagonistic and radical energy in an isolationist culture that promotes self-centeredness. Winshew Lee reminds us that present within neoliberal governmentality is an isolating force. Empathy frustrates that force because empathy excites engagement. It is a liberating posture in these times. And if love is the elimination of the expansive spaces that may separate us, then empathy might very well be understood as a position we must take when that distance is cleared. The movement from the position of egotism to thoughtful concern of the other. The movement from our contented social locations to that of dislocation. The examination of our excess, access, and privileges as possible contributing factors for the denials, lack, and experiences of marginalization in the lives of some others. Analyses of our various oppressions, and, dare I say it, the ways we might also oppress. Neoliberalism does not seek to wholly extinguish our affective energies, however. Instead, neoliberalism seeks to reroute our energies to other more valuable and profitable sources, namely goods, and even the good, when it too is profitable. Take, for example, Nike's cancer awareness shoes. That's what they're called. Nike fans, and I am one, can purchase everything from a hot pink and white ankle-top pair of Jordans to a pair of hot pink of what they call Under Armour, Under Love, breast cancer bloodline PEs. Long name for a pair of sneakers, I didn't make it up. And I confess, I actually have a pair of hot pink and gray LeBron James sneakers of my own. Yet, for all of the good excuses that I have provided others on the excessive amount of money that I spent on my sneakers for a cause, and even though some of that money has been used to support breast cancer awareness, I talk about it all the time every time someone says it, the good, our breast cancer awareness, was commodified to sell a good, the sneaker. So, yes, neoliberalism desires affect when such affect energizes the market. But what about the type of affect that moves our hearts, our spirits, to deeply consider the other? What about the uses of empathy? So I want to return to Newark, the place that groomed me in the practice of transformative justice work, and where I also discovered the power of empathy as a way to think through empathy's possibilities. The story begins with the epithet faggot and a bullet. It ends with a 17-year-old teenage male hospitalized because of a shot wound to the leg. The young brother's family was grateful that he survived, and community members were enraged that a shooting had occurred, which seemed to have been the result of the perpetrator's disdain for queer folk. And it's important for me to note at this point that even while I'm providing yet another example of tragedy that occurred in black, brown, working class Newark, events precipitated by heterosexism and other isms occur in all spaces. Indeed, many bullets, whether composed of some form of metal or prejudiced ideologies, are shot daily, even here in Cambridge. But back to Noah.
Not the Kennedy School, though.
I was chairing the city's commission on LGBTQ concerns, and at the time had been intricately involved in community organizing, particularly in the wake of trouble and tragedy. I decided to host a pizza party at my apartment, not too far from where Philip and I were living, for the young brother and his family. I invited friends to join us, and within a few days, the community began to organize, and we worked tirelessly to ensure that Mayor Booker and the police responded appropriately to what was clearly a hate crime. We were soon joined by a well-known and well-funded LGBTQ organization based in New Jersey. The well-known and well-funded organization, which had been leading the pro-same-sex marriage lobbying efforts in the state, joined us and decided to tutor the community members on social justice approaches. We were strongly encouraged by the group's leader, who lived in a comfortable suburb 20 minutes away, to take the young brother story to the press. Make noise, he exclaimed. He believed that justice would be served if we were successful at creating a buzz, which is but another form of branding the good in the media. Yet, for all the energy that organization possessed, and I'm sure they meant well, it was clear that this leader in particular had not considered the potential negative impact of a media campaign on the lives of this young brother and his family. The social justice leader failed to decenter self and wander even shortly into the life world of the other. This particular leader in the field of social justice failed to employ empathy. Had he considered truly the life world of the family, he would have been reminded that the assailant had yet to be apprehended and was therefore still present in the very community that the family lived. He would have considered how a media campaign would have trivialized the life of a young brother who, though had disclosed his sexual identity to a loving and supportive mother, had yet to share the same with his other family members. He may have also considered what life would have been like for the family soon after the cameras were to be packed away and the story hastily replaced in media by another, soon after he jumped in his car and drove 20 minutes away back to the suburbs. The lack of empathy certainly fortifies the ego, doesn't it? And frustrates our ability to regard the others. And that is why empathy is necessary in the lives and work of those who seek to transform our world. It is an obligatory posture in a market-driven time that seeks to reroute our effective energies towards everything but the other. Unless, of course, various capitals are to be gained by doing so. On pleasure. Pleasure is the seat of our desires. Pleasure animates our yearnings and our bodies. And pleasure can be experienced and expressed in various ways, not just kissing. Kissing's good though. But I want to take up pleasure as a way to think about the unification of our bodies, desires, and spirits within community, which are the very elements that are often disassociated under neoliberalism, according to Wen Shu Lee. Our bodies are not machines, and our desires fuel. Furthermore, to work and to be productive assumes that one is able to labor. Work and productivity is an ableist concept, as brilliantly articulated by my friend Eddie Ndupu. Ndupu testifies, quote, "I reject the notion that my body has to be pigeonholed into hegemonic definitions of personhood in order for me to be regarded as valuable. I am valuable because I am a manifestation of the universe. I don't need to work because, to borrow the words of Audre Lorde, quote, I am my best work. A series of roadmaps, reports, recipes, doodles, and prayers from the front line," end quote. To echo Ndupu, our value as healing spirit beings does not come from our ability to use our bodies, if we can, toward the end of various forms of production. And when we do not or cannot produce goods or the good, we may suffer from being fashioned as metonyms for failure and the unrealized American dream. Thus, there is ever present a need to consider the possibilities of pleasure, of the intricate association of our bodies, of our desires, of our spirit, as conduits for connection to self and the other, and the type of work that nourishes our spirit even as it replenishes the world. Does your work help you nourish your spirit even as you replenish the world? And there are many moments where I've witnessed pleasure expressed in ways that allow for both. For example, many activists, artists, community leaders, etc. would gather once a month at an event organized by my friend and scholar activist Larry Lyons at his home on Martin Luther King Boulevard in Newark. There's always a Martin Luther King Boulevard in summer and cities. And I will find it and I'll probably live there. Larry named the monthly and sometimes bi-monthly gathering Passions. How appropriate a name for a gathering space created for those who sought to do justice in our community. In any event, folk were asked to present on that which moves them, that which they were passionate about, and had the option of doing so through various performance formats. Some presented papers, others stories, dance, visual, and poetic performances. Indeed, Isaiah Wooden remarks, quote, pleasure often energizes acts of creativity, end quote. So we cried a lot, we laughed more, we conversed over potluck meal and wine aplenty within a passionate gathering. And we were all moved as we reminded ourselves and others of the various reasons we've come here. The various reasons we've come here. Not to Newark, not to Cambridge, but here, to this place, at this time, to this universe, to this world. Why did we come to live, to work? What was our responses to how we were to shape the world and ourselves? We were reminded that the desires that move our bodies to act and our spirits to thrive are irradiated by pleasure. In a different place, many miles from Newark, I learned another lesson about pleasure. In January 2012, I traveled with 15 other U.S. cultural workers, activists, and scholars to the Middle East. Tim was with us as part of this first delegation to Palestine. The journey resulted in a production of many tears. We cried a lot. There was a lot of righteous indignation because of the ongoing occupation of Palestinian land and bodies by the state of Israel. I felt ashamed because of the complicity of the U.S. government, and therefore my own complicity in advancing the occupation. And while there aren't a lot of words to adequately describe the horror of what we saw, as it continues to shape and disrupt the lives of Palestinians and Israelis for that matter, I remember what I felt. I can recall one moment in particular that reminded me of the place and power of the body and spirit as they are situated in various systems of oppression. We witnessed an atrocity in Palestine, but we also witnessed the luminous spirit of a people who daily survive despite occupation. And many survive, though not all, because they live. After we traveled and witnessed and dialogued, our host took some of us dancing. Didn't think I was going to talk about dancing in this one. And we danced until we laughed and sweated and remembered why it is that we had all come. Not only to Palestine, but here, to this place. We remembered that our spirits, our bodies are not machines, and our desires fuel. We remember that a people's land can be occupied and even the body, but our spirits cannot. And pleasure was indeed our doorway to such remembrance. I was also reminded that without belly-busting laughter, big bright smiles, joyful tears, hugs, touch, and dance, to offset the petrifying screams, raised fists, sorrowful bemoaning, thrust, silences, and protests, the life of the social justice worker will indeed lack pleasure. In this regard, Foucault admonishes, quote, do not think that one has to be sad in order to be militant, even though the thing one is fighting is abominable, end quote. And if we are to remake a world and recreate systems, then we must engage transformative work free from the energies of misdirected rage, melancholy, and disdain that tend to characterize our present moment. Right now, there are some that were burning Obama signs in Mississippi, Oxford, Mississippi. About 100 or so, mostly youth, mostly young people. We can radically reimagine and fashion a world and experience pleasure even as we engage the work. Pleasure does not have to be a dirty word in this time, particularly among those who seek to do justice. This brings me to my final question. What then does freedom feel like? Does freedom feel like rage, apathy, hatred? Does freedom feel like love, empathy, and pleasure? Or does freedom feel like an intermingling of various types of affect? What does freedom feel like? I want to propose that freedom feels. Freedom feels. Freedom moves. Freedom is the condition that allows feeling, as opposed to numbing, denying, or disrupting it. In an age that is antagonistic to feeling as a force of connection to self, others, our spirit, and the planet. Freedom is also the condition for movement. That's why dance is important in Palestine. And these are moving times. For so long, we have imagined freedom's external manifestations. We imagine what freedom looks like. But it's time to imagine freedom's interiority and our own. What does freedom feel like? What obstructions does freedom move? And more importantly, what do you feel like in this age of neoliberalism? And how might those feelings move you or keep you from moving? Love, empathy, and pleasure may be the types of affect necessary to transform ourselves, our communities, our world, our souls, that which is necessary to move us to do our work, as Audre Lorde would say, to produce good in the world, and to refuse the commodification of our work and our bodies in the process, even in these times. Thank you. I should have asked, what does giving a 40-minute talk feel like when you're done? It feels like a dry throat. But I think we have time for discussion.
Yes.
So open up the floor, yes.
Okay, so thank you so much. I think of Camden, I think of Whitman,
Sure.
I think of poetry. I took some jottings on a Starbucks napkin. You know, that corporate...
Always trying to be ironic, aren't you?
Yes, Tim, I find irony is part of my joy of life. Because it's that corporate entity that encourages us to come in and have access to wireless so we don't have to talk to anybody else and can sit by ourselves in our own little worlds at an atomized series of tables.
Sure.
But it's funny because the beginning of your talk, when you talk about neoliberalism, it put me in mind of the old humorous definition of a liberal who loves humanity but hates people. And your talk just spoke to that, you know, because it feels like sometimes we are in these crowds seeking social justice with people who love social justice but don't really care for people or don't have ways of aren't encouraged even to express it. So there are two examples of love that I wanted to mention and make it really a question. One is that I find in my long history of working in the LGBT activist movement, I have found wonderful compatriots and loving people, humorous people, people who love pleasure, people who appreciate, who understand empathy and exhibit it. But I also find a lot of people who have been so wounded by homophobia. I'm not a therapist, but I wonder sometimes if they're, and the person that you referenced, the leader in New Jersey, I've only met once, but I suspect is an example of this, so wounded that everything turns out to be about him. He's always having to heal that wound with a kind of narcissism that is competitive, it's careless of others, and it's very disturbing. So I sometimes think we, having spent quite a bit of money, not on Nikes, but on therapy, that we need to heal ourselves in some ways to be capable of loving ourselves and therefore capable of loving others, which I know is kind of trite, but I sort of believe it. And then lastly, an example from my own experience in the last months where love can be so perverted. And the example that I want to give you, and maybe there's space to talk about it here, is parental love, where there are fundamentalist Protestant Latino parents who are throwing their queer children out of the home because they really, if you say you're not loving your kid, their answer would be, I love my kid more than you do because I care for his eternal or her eternal soul, and you only care about the temporal pleasures of life and indulging their homoerotic desires and so on. And so my love, even if it denies them a place to live and sleep and have shelter and so forth, is actually a more important consideration than the kind of thing that you're calling love, which is a false love which comes from the devil. And I'm absolutely serious speaking to that. That is not an exaggeration.
Thank you. A few responses. So the one thing that comes to mind, I'm always interested in this. Henry Nouwen speaks of the wounded healer, right? Like this notion that there are most of us who are feeling called to these helping, healing professions often show up wounded, most of us, all of us. Indeed, so I did a clinical counseling program, and I found when I finished that I went for myself. I would sit in class and I would every diagnosis that we would learn. And like, that is absolutely me. And it seems like you cannot be histrionic, bipolar, and all these things at once. I'm like, I want to return to that, to this idea of a wounded healer, and just think about that for a second. But so I think you're right that many of us show up having to do work on ourselves and oftentimes become experts at doing external work, but fail at doing internal work. So I always ask this question, who is the I in the intersection? We talk about intersectionality, it's fancy, we love that word in social justice. Intersectional, intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, black feminism. And I'm stopping and I say, well, who's the I in the intersection? Who are you? And the way I ask that question is this. We, for so long, I think, have mastered the art of identifying whose feet are situated on our neck. That's sort of intersection. That's where we've gotten in terms of intersectionality. I can identify all of the ways in which oppression has impacted me. I can tell you whose feet are situated on my neck. What we have not been able to do is to identify whose necks our feet are situated on. Yes. So the work, I think, is this notion of sort of pointing out the I in the intersection, right? Like figuring out not only how I am the oppressed, but how I might be implicated in oppression. To not become experts at determining who's the sort of enemies, quote, that I need to sort of be responding against, but how I might be doing the work of terrorizing the life of someone else. But in regards to sort of love and religiosity, I went to seminary. I started to get clinical counseling program in seminary. So I think I went to the clinical counseling program to be able to deal with seminary. So I had to do a lot of thinking about, like, love has been, taken up in these spaces and sort of owned by these spaces, right? And we have to recuperate love and challenge individuals to rethink the definitions of love. Like you, I have had to counsel young people who've been kicked out of their homes by, say, a grandfather who's a pastor. So if love, and the way I think about love, is the elimination of the distance, of the expanse, of the space that exists between individuals, right? It's the eliminating of that distance, the bringing together of two things that otherwise would be separated. I wouldn't name that love if in fact the separation has been that much more widened, increased by throwing someone out the house. But I don't have the perfect definition for love. I think that's what we can do in community, but I also want to say that we can recuperate definitions within community and begin to also think about love. I had someone really, I do Twitter, and there's this radical, I shouldn't say that, it almost sounded like I'm being coy, and I was. But there's a person that is, who deems themselves radical, and they were talking about radical politics and all this stuff, and I'm like, so how do we talk about love? That's a radical act. They're like, I don't talk about love. Do you read my work? I don't talk about love. So I'm like, well, one, I didn't read your work. but the fact that love somehow is not understood as a radical, as itself being a radical way of being in the world, surprises me. That to say love in these times amongst progressives or radicals is often, people look at you like, what are you talking love? Rage. Protest, fight in the machine, even the rhetorics that we use, right? And I want to say, if the energy of the world that we exist in is all of that which I just named, I don't think I want to recreate a world with that same energy. Because you'll have different systems, new communities emerge, and you'll be mad as hell, same type of energy you had that you were trying to fend off in your radical resistance movements, right? So I want to return to love as a radical possibility. This thing that Audre Lorde, Michel Foucault, these queers, Cheryl Clark were talking about in 1978 and 81. And return to that as a possibility. Yes. I told you not to ask me any questions.
I know, but I have you. So, you talk a lot about love being kind of like this unifying energy for, say, positive social change, right? I guess I was thinking about, one, like you said, love is kind of this thing that's hard to understand, something hard to control. Like I fall in love with women I should never fall in love with. But what about other elements like anger? Like I once read this story in Sports Illustrated about this baseball manager, and he had a really talented team. Like they had all the discipline, all the things they needed, but they just couldn't come together as a team. So what he did was he just became this unbearable jerk, and he united the team in hating him. So everybody in the team hated him. But the thing was, they didn't have a great season because they were still united, even though it was with this angst towards this jerk manager. So when it comes to, creating, even if it's just a temporary sense of community or whatever, just to create some positive change, how do you feel about other things besides love?
Yeah, so rage can absolutely be righteous. Bell Hooks' book comes to mind, this notion of righteous rage, right? That we can absolutely, anger has its uses. Even Audre Lorde writes about the uses of anger, as I say, entitled The Uses of Anger. I often think though, too much anger, too much rage, and that's also to say, so one, I'm agreeing with you. I think that anger has its uses. And I think that we have theorized that a lot. I think that we talk about anger a lot. And I'm thinking particularly about social justice communities. The things that I don't think we talk about as much with the same force of ideas, with the same sort of force as a possibility, or as a mode of change, are some of these other things that I try to talk about, right? Like, we don't really talk about pleasure is radical. The need for joy is a radical thing. Empathy is radical. You don't hear that. But we will say righteous rage. And I want to, so I think, and again, affect is tricky to talk about. Affect, this is a spectrum of sort of feelings, right? And they're not so monolithic as I'm trying to make them here. But I guess what I want to do is say that we need to create the space to engage all of those ranges of possibilities and ranges of affect.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure, yes.
Do you think the hesitancy to say accepting love as a radical thing is a learned behavior or a natural thing?
Do we have any developments? I don't know.
Okay, that's fair.
In terms of movements, I mean, it could have a lot to do with the types of spaces we're existing in, the conversations that we're allowing ourselves to be part of, what we're hearing, in media. I mean, how many of y'all, do you all hear? It is a very good question, but I'm interested in hearing, like, do all of you hear love, or empathy, or pleasure talked about enough? Like, do you hear these things? Like, particularly within what we might want to call, and I'm very careful to say progressive circles or radical circles. There isn't a circle, right? I am no way claiming that there's sort of these monolithic communities. But I've never really been engaged within the communities I've been in doing social justice. And let me be very clear. Doing social justice work can be some of the hardest work ever. Because you go to it thinking, oh my gosh, social justice. I'm going to go to these communities, we're going to make change, only to find out when you get there, you can be some of the meanest folk. No, I'm serious. And you're like, wait, I know we're not trying to create a new world, and we are mean. Here, in this circle that's trying to create a new world, and look at the energy that we're creating it with. I have never encountered more hurt because I had this expectation that I'm going to go with the queers that's working on this campaign. I'm going to work with these groups over here. We're going to do it in love, only to have arguments. And I'm not trying to make this, everything's going to be clean and fancy. But I want to say if we can be intentional about the sort of employing the type of energies like rage that we think can be so helpful in our movement, we should be just as intentional to thinking about the possibility of friendship, camaraderie, love, joy, smiling. I often say the most radical thing you can do is smile at somebody when you walk out your house. Because if you think you're going to change somebody's world and you can't look a person in the eye and smile, you need to go rethink your calling. Because I don't want to be led by someone who's living with that type of energy. So these are the types of things that I want to recuperate and bring back to the center of what it might mean to rethink and redo a world. Yes.
So we talked before, and
Yes.
I told you I had really high expectations, and I was to be inspired and everything, and it all happened. It was great.
Thank you. I was going to run out the door.
And then I'm not sure it's a question, it could be a comment. Let's see what it is when I get to the end of it. But I recently watched a documentary called Love, Free or Die, which some of you might have seen. It's about the first openly gay bishop within the Episcopal Church, Gene Robinson of the Diocese of New Hampshire. And so Love, Free or Die is interesting because it's a nice riff on the New Hampshire slogan. But also I think it already speaks to what you were saying in relationship to freedom and love as things that are very tightly connected. So in the movie, there's this one section where he gives a lecture / sermon in a church during Gay Pride Day in New York, and he laments the fact that in society at the time he was speaking, and probably still now, the one problem is, or the biggest problem for him is that we still live at in a time where people don't accept questions such as marriage equality, etc., as basic questions of justice, but still think about them as questions of compassion or religious belief or tolerance and things like that, and not as basic questions of justice, as which they have sort of begun to be seen in the courts of law, which have appropriately acted when these things have been brought to their attention, when they've heard cases to do with marriage equality. And yet we have a moment where, as of today, or with the results, the ballot measures last night, I would say that there probably is a tendency or there could be a tendency to interpret the results in all 4 states that had marriage equality as a ballot measure as a new trend where we've sort of come over this tipping point where people maybe start to see it as an issue of justice rather than an issue of an expression of their own creed or convictions. So my question then maybe is how would you bring, like when you talk about love and pleasure and empathy, for instance, how do they relate to justice? I mean, is that what makes justice? Is that the foundation for all justice? I mean, I think it is, so maybe this is a comment more than a question, that's why I wasn't sure. But if you could speak to that a little bit.
That's an amazing question. Actually, it's an amazing question. Yeah, so how does love and empathy and pleasure relate to justice? And if the justice is the sort of end, the thing that we want to aspire to, what do we need to get there? What routes would one need to take? And I want to believe that love and empathy and pleasure, as they might be embodied in our social justice movement work, can be routes to get there, can be the things that we need to bring about justice. And thank you for that, because I actually hadn't thought about it, but I want to now, and will actually do some more.
Yeah, because where it sort of came from is this understanding, when we think about justice in sort of a common, broad, whatever, assumed understanding of the word, it's not something that strikes us as particularly emotional. I mean, It strikes us as supposedly being quite the opposite of that, of being blind, right? And yet you could interpret that blindness as one that also could be a precondition for a true love, or for a true pleasure, that is unconditional, right, and hence equal, and hence blind.
Yeah.
So I'm beginning to see that these things are actually a lot more connected than they might seem to be on the surface.
I think some of the answers to that lie in a feminist theory of justice, which isn't absolutely rational and dispassionate. You know, it isn't Rawlsian, it isn't Kantian. It's informed with passion and feeling and empathy and so on.
Yeah, it's great, thank you.
Yes, no, I'm another man, but here we go. Could you speak a little bit more about the internal transformation work and how it relates to the work that we do externally, and particularly how that relates to shame and kind of extending our sense of personhood and kind of closing what you talked about, those circles of identity, circles of love?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the self-work is hard. And one of the things that I come to think about is what I've learned, what I've now called intra-locality. I hate making up deals like this. We don't need another one, just whatever. But it's
You love me.
But it was a way for me to think about our social locations, who we are, our context. A way to think about it. Intersectionality is about analyzing the systems of interconnected oppressions that exist outside of us. Intralocality might be a bad way to think about it, but word to use might be a way to sort of map our own intersecting context. The work of self-reflexive analysis, as my friend Stephanie would say, right? But that work is dangerous work because what it does, it reveals not only the limitations that we may face, yes, but it also will actually illuminate our privileges too. And I think that's the hardest part, to find out that we all show up with varying degrees of privilege, particularly for those of us who are interested in doing social justice work, because then it says, oh, I'm actually implicated in the very thing that I'm trying to work against. And it's that implication that can stunt than the work on self. So I believe then that in this time where we've done a lot of really good work at analyzing all of the sort of range of forces that we have to deal with outside of us, the harder work of turning inward, which sort of sounds psychological, and I'm not trying to say, it isn't, maybe it is, and people sort of resist it because of that, but this sort of work of mapping out who we are in the world, it becomes vitally important. Now, what happens then for the shamed, and for the multiply shamed are those who experience various forms of shame and have to return to oneself. And in the same way I think about oppression, that we all might name ourselves as the oppressed in various circumstances. And then to that I say, yes, we are oppressed, but oftentimes we can be the oppressed and the oppressor. We can be the shamed and the shamer, too. And that's another part of work that becomes really hard. I can name the ways in which I've experienced shame as a Black, queer person growing up and working class and poor and sometimes violent, Camden, right? But then what about the shame that I might have acted on someone, even in that same space as a male-bodied, masculine identified person of various class. So these things aren't as clean cut, I think, as we would want them to be. We can be both the oppressed and the oppressor. We can be both the shamed and the shamer. And in order to sort of discern that, we do need to turn inward and sort of map out our own stuff. The working it out is the harder part, isn't it? How do you give up? Do you give up those privileges that might be the reason that oppression is enacted in their life for someone else? What do you do with privilege? Can privilege have a useful end? Those are questions that and it's daily work, I think. That's work that we have to do every day.
I just wanted to appreciate your locality, especially here in HKS, because I feel like here, more than maybe many other places, that false dichotomy of the intellectual and quantitative versus something that's emotional is alive and blossoming here, and that need to reintegrate it is very strong. And some of it, I don't want to glorify people of color cultures or international people from other countries, but I do think that's a danger that we have, bringing folks here to have them learn from a certain educational system where often there are cultures that have a more integrated sense of enjoying one another, basking in our culture, sharing food and dance and music and moments of joy that we kind of pound out of ourselves, and we no longer take time for the big whist games and the other things and cooking for each other, and it's just like strop by Trader Joe. So, and I would say, it has existed not only in a lot of the great lesbian gay literature on struggle, except but like even Che Guevara with all the things that, Nacho and da-da-da, but said, I think, something like, the greatest revolutionary is motivated by great feelings of love. And so if we can both tap into that without losing the credibility we have with all the other things. And some of the things that have felt really disempowering here lately is even the people who are our allies, who are real, not even neoliberals, but like liberals, progressives even within the HKS spectrum. I've heard two of them, one African-American straight and one white straight, but like allies, people who I turn to, using, and then, if we're doing polls, and then now you're not only just this, but you're a Black lesbian. And there are people who care about the lesbian and the Black struggle, but they use that as a sense of kind of comical, most of you will get that giggle with me when I say that. And then the other person saying, likewise, talking about something that's real, the weaknesses when we start fragmenting into small communities, but always using, and then you're a disabled Black lesbian, as a way of, let's all unite around the fact that we're fragmented too much. I don't know, I'm just trying to bring together ways that we feel disempowered and the importance of what you're talking about. And so thank you so much for bringing me out here.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out really quick, I love that this notion between a sort of rational and an affective somehow, the mind, or sort of the objective versus the subjective is somehow seen as the higher, as if anything's objective, right? You can tell sort of my camp, I know I have a whole different theoretical understanding of what okay, that's a whole, but I think there is a need to return to this very important point that you bring up. So one of the fun things I get to do, M. Jackie Alexander is a black diaspora transnational feminist who was actually a contemporary of Audre Lorde and co-hosted the conference that celebrated Audre before she passed away from cancer. And I'm fortunate to be on the board of Jackie's organization, which is called the Tobago Center for the Study and Practice of Indigenous Spirituality. And the reason why I bring this up is because the main force behind the center is the return to indigenous knowledges and practices that are often negated within a capitalist system. Well, two things happen. You either sort of use them and then you sort of make profit off of those practices, or you negate them altogether. And this idea of this fracturing between what one might call the spiritual and the something other, the rational and the irrational, if it's too feeling, the subjective and the objective. And I think embedded in many cultures are, it's not as in African traditional religions, for example, there are no demarcations between, let's say, the secular and the sacred, right? So like in many worlds, in many life worlds, we come as full beings, feeling, thinking beings. It never asks to be a thinking being in one setting and a feeling being in the other, and then gendering those things after that. Such that if you're a feeler, you're somehow now gendered feminine, because that's, or something other, like all of the, there is a need to return to the integration of these things, right? And to resist, and it's not just a neoliberalist pull, but also to resist a sort of Western construction then of how we've come to understand about feeling and thinking in this age. And I think that's really important. Yes.
Hi, so one thing I wanted to thank you for was the fact that I think one thing I struggled with since coming to the college, and I'm a junior here, is coming into this space that is, and I hate using this word because it feels kind of pejorative, like progressive space. And in doing so, I have learned a lot about privileges and my own privileges and different oppressions that have been put upon me. And I think sometimes the danger is kind of internalizing identity politics that are playing out in a broader spectrum, and it can be, like you said, kind of like something that stops progress within yourself and social change. And I also, when I was listening to you speak, I kept on thinking of this quote my mom used to say to me, which is from Maya Angelou, which is, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And that's kind of beside my question kind of point. So the other day, and this is kind of related to the election, so I'll apologize about that. One of the lists here, and that's what a lot of student groups do, will send things out over email lists, said that this article that is Obama the woman's choice? And at first I was kind of like, what kind of question is that? We want Romney to be our president so we can, have abortion rights taken away from us and binders full of women and all that good stuff, of course. But then I really stopped and thought about it, and there was some debate, which was, well, on one hand, what are you going to do? You're not going to vote for Obama, saying you can vote in this election, and just use it as an act of protest, which could backfire in that Romney would potentially be the next president. Or do you step back and kind of go, well, on the other hand, you do have in the Democratic Party this kind of commodification of women at the same time. So it's like a fight for women, but it's a commodification of women, and I feel like that happens a lot with oppressed groups. So my question is, in this system where incrementalism and kind of this commodification is such a damaging thing, how do you suggest we start to bring about change? And I know that's an extremely huge and broad question, and I'm obviously not looking for an exact answer, but what would be your suggestion?
That is such a great question and a big one. I was like, it's such an important question, and I don't know if I have a direct answer, because I think that requires thought, and I think it requires some working out in community. But what I want to affirm in your question is this this notion of how even within social justice work, identity politics, identities can be commodified easily for the good, which is why I talked about how the good is commodified. And one of the things, you think about it, we're sort of within LGBTQ movement work, where the movement has, step back before I say anything and make sure no tomatoes are going to be thrown. I want to say that I support marriage equality. But what happens in this moment right now is that, and I'm going to try to use this as a way to get to your question, to respond, is that within LGBTQ movement, because it's now understood to be a monolithic thing, there is a movement, not movements, because everyone, if you're LGBTQ, is concerned about marriage equality. No. But the good, marriage equality, has been commodified. So much so, I'll give examples of how there are groups that raise money, like, I'm trying to not be too specific, but you get an email and it's like, give $20 and say I do. Like, say I do to this $20 gift. Okay. Now, what's left out, what happens in that moment is sort of there's this need to sort of not only market and to pull in dollars, but sort of sentiment to sort of galvanize legions of people who can support. At the same time, forget that within this sort of LGBTQ spectrum exists so many other issues, namely the top ones right now are like youth homelessness, educational needs of LGBTQ, blah, blah, blah. Now, how does one within an LGBTQ movement begin to push against such commodification but say something about it? So part of what I have attempted to do and some others along a range is to actually speak up and say, wait, you're talking about an LGBTQ movement or an LGBTQ community. I identify as gay, and that is not my platform. Or that's not the priorities on my platform. Another example I give in Newark, I decided to sort of try to go out and prove my point by doing a survey of individuals in the community, in this LGBTQ community in Newark. And we asked them sort of, what are your priority areas? And how many of you think marriage equality was the first one on the list? If you think marriage equality was the first thing on the list of these LGBTQ Newarkers, raise your hand. It absolutely was not. And I don't know if it made the list. But what was on there was safety, public safety, education, and something else. I can't remember. But the point, so that survey becomes an action. It becomes a way for us to speak back to a mass movement and to say, listen, you're actually missing a whole section of people and their needs, right, in this sort of movement that you have now capitalized off of. And we're going to need you to refocus so that some of the needs of those with whom you're leaving out are met. So those are examples of ways, and I guess what I'm trying to say is we have to speak. You have to speak. I don't know what a better way to say. I don't know if there's a fancy answer for it. When we know that this is happening, speak up and say something about it. Again, it's an Audre Lorde Human Rights Lecture. Audre says, your silence will not protect you. That's a burden for many of us. Many of us who often feel like that bridge, that's called our backs, right? Where you're always having to speak up and always having to say something, always having to be that one in the room when everybody else is dancing and you're sitting there like this, giving them a side eye. I hate that. That's always me. Like I'm like, I'm not dancing. I'm going to resist pleasure. But we speak.
Can I ask? I have 2 questions, and I have 100 questions. First of all, I want to say thank you just for being here. This is brilliant, and you are brilliant. Thank you. One thing I want to ask you about empathy, because as you know, I'm all about the social and social movements, and empathy is critical, radical empathy, the kind of empathy that you've described. Yet, in our work, the intellectual work and the political work, there is a lot of critique of empathy as a mode of solidarity, a mode of an expression of love, a way of bringing people together. And some of those critics feel that certain kinds of lived experiences, certain kinds of subjective differences, are always going to prevent the two of us from ever being able to fully empathize with each other, right? And to say nothing of all the other people we encounter in different worlds. So how do you speak, because you are, I think, speaking back to those critics, and I love that, but and I speak back to them, but I want to hear you intervene in that, because I think your work does speak back to the critics of empathy and reclaim a more radical notion of empathy, which I think is absolutely essential to the kind of work that we're trying to do in the world. That's my first question. Sure. A little one. The second question I have is the way that you position love and empathy and pleasure is as modes of resistance within a neoliberal context. That love and empathy and pleasure are the pushbacks, are the modes of resistance, are the acts of rebellion that allow for us to exist and survive, perhaps even flourish within a context of neoliberalism. What happens? Is it possible to dismantle neoliberalism? Is it possible to destroy it? Is it possible for us to revolutionize our political economy into something far more free for all of us? And so, is that possible? And within a context of non-neoliberalism, or an alternative to neoliberalism, do love, joy, and love, empathy, and pleasure feel differently? Do they cease to exist? What happens when you take the rebellion out of those three things?
Wonderful question. Yes. So radical empathy is a sort of term that Kathy Cohen takes up. Yeah, you would.
Yeah.
And I think the way that Kathy, what I took away from hearing Kathy Cohen talk about radical empathy at Columbia had something to do with the notion of empathy not only being a sort of way of relating to another or trying to sort of traffic in the life world of another person or to try to relate and get to know the life world of another person, but that empathy also becomes, it allows for solidarity, right? So that it allows for solidarities, it allows for the walls that might otherwise separate us to be diminished. And I think that is, when it comes to, well, how do you not sort of engage in, particularly what one calls like identity, sort of identity politic context. How do we keep ourselves from isolating so much on our own subjective experience that disallows us from seeing and moving and understanding the life world of somebody else because we're so focused on our stuff. But I think there are many examples of solidarities being formed, even in our present moment, that speaks back to the power of radical empathy. I think, again, of the Palestinian solidarity movement right now, and how folk from a range of various social locations, a range of social locations are thinking, they're beginning to think into, to really deeply care for, to examine the lives of Palestinian people. And these are people coming from a range of social, economic, ability, sexual contexts, who are now in solidarity around one cause. But that took individuals to do the work of sort of moving self out of the way, and actually, or even using self as a way to get to the context of somebody else, to do that type of connecting work. But I don't know, is it possible for neoliberalism to be dismantled? And And are we talking about neoliberalist political economic systems? And then one must talk about also its ideologies. So it might be possible for us to reimagine systems. Is it possible for us to sort of dismantle ideologies and the ways that it works in our social lives? I'm not sure. I want to say so, yes. I want to be hopeful and believe that that's possible. I also know that to sort of disrupt and undo ideologies that so fracture our human relationships, that those things are harder to sort of, which is why I think it's important to talk about neoliberalism's work within social justice movements, even those movements that attempt to disrupt neoliberalism. It tells you that it's hard work to do because you may be trying to just, change a system, but if the ideologies are the spirit of a thing, invades even the work that you do, it proves how difficult it is to sort of disrupt that. But I think that yes, I think that the times, the age that we exist in absolutely may change the texture of these things that we're talking about, love, pleasure, and empathy, of these things that I don't have a definition for, really. And I think this is wonderful, I didn't think about this, but to imagine love and empathy and pleasure as resistances, and might they be imagined as something other than that, right? And then what does that look like if they're not existing to resist? Which is a really important question.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, because we're going to be like this. Anybody else have a question? Okay. Oh, yeah.
How do you see the love and empathy and pleasure playing out in you mentioned it briefly, but in masculine relationships, and how I see such a barrier in the stereotypical heteronormative masculinity I see between a lot of my friends, and it just seems like such a barrier to get over, because those things are not even, it's not allowed in a relationship. You give each other a hug every once in a while, and we're not going to see each other for a year. That's it.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. And what I didn't do is talk about sort of the gendering of these affects too, right? Types of expression of affect and the ways in which we've come to think about a lot of these things, which is in gendered ways. Empathy as the feminine, pleasure as the feminine, or if it's imagined as something like to be sexual pleasure as possibly the masculine. Love, so I think that these things are also gendered within our sort of social life. But particularly as it relates to sort of masculinities and the ways that any of these things show up, I think it's it might be fair to argue that this is not sort of conjured in a masculine imaginary, these ideas that we're talking about. Men teaching loving, empathy, pleasure of all things, which is why Michel Foucault's work is so important. Because again, Michel Foucault is saying it isn't about the sexual act, really, that's at stake. What's really the problem for society is the radical possibility of intimacy that looks different than sexual intimacy, that looks different than even pornography, right? And this is what actually Cheryl Clark, who's talking about differently oriented relationships between women, is also saying. Mutuality is what's at stake. So, gendered relationships are set up, many of them in ways that attempts to disrupt relationality, particularly when it doesn't involve sex, because sexual identities are organic. We can go on and on with this here, right? But I think one of the things to ask ourselves is, what does love, pleasure, and empathy mean for us in our, not just in our social justice movements, but in our human relationships, in our relationships to one another, in our relationships to one another as men, as women, as trans, as cisgender people, intimately involved, sexually involved, however involved, and how might they be employed, and what might that mean for men within a homosocial male space to use love and empathy and pleasure as the sort of rubrics for a community. That might be pretty radical, Thank you all.